Most people think Leman Russ was the Emperor's blunt instrument, the attack dog, the executioner who burned an entire planet's worth of his own brothers because his master told him to, and who failed to finish Horus when it counted most. That reading is everywhere, in the fan debates, in the lore summaries, in how people talk about the Space Wolves whenever Prospero comes up. Russ hated Magnus. Russ was too stupid to see past his own prejudice. Russ wrecked the Imperium's best chance at winning the heresy. That reading ignores a scene that happens before any of it. A scene from Graham McNeill's 1,000 Suns, Horus Heresy Book 12, that changes what everything else means. Russ didn't hate Magnus. He knew something about Magnus's legion that Magnus himself barely wanted to admit. What he did with that knowledge is one of the most quietly devastating things in the entire heresy, and almost nobody talks about it. The case against Leman Russ isn't a weak one, and it deserves to be stated fully before anything else. He was the Emperor's designated executioner, one of two primarchs assigned the role of destroying rogue Space Marine legions when they deviated from Imperial law, the other being Lion L. Johnson. He attended the Council of Nikaea in 001 M31 and argued harder than almost anyone to ban psychic powers from the legions, motivated, his critics say, by simple ignorance and cultural prejudice against sorcery. He then marched on Prospero and burned it, the city of Tizca, the greatest repository of human knowledge in the Imperium, reduced to ash and cooling rock. He failed to kill Horus when he had the blade physically inside him, and the Emperor paid for that failure with everything. Every one of those charges is real. Now let's look at what actually happened behind them. It starts on a world called Shrike, during a joint campaign between the Space Wolves and the 1,000 Suns in the Arc-Reach cluster. The details are in McNeill's 1,000 Suns. A 1,000 Suns warrior named Hastur, a member of the Pavoni cult within the Legion, which specialized in biomantic psychic disciplines, overexerted his powers during combat operations. What happened next wasn't gradual. His body began mutating, bones reshaping beneath his armor, flesh splitting and reforming into shapes that had nothing to do with a human body. The 1,000 Suns had a word for this. They had lived in fear of it since the earliest years of the Great Crusade. They called it the flesh change. To understand why that moment matters so much, you need to understand what the flesh change actually was, not just as a plot point, but as a secret the 1,000 Suns had been dying to keep for decades. From almost the moment the Legion was founded, the 1,000 Suns had been developing uncontrolled psychic mutations en masse. A wave of degenerative changes working through the ranks, transforming Marines into something that could no longer be called Astartes. The mutations were catastrophic. The spiral of degenerative change ultimately ended with affected Marines becoming chaos spawn. The 1,000 Suns were being consumed from inside, their gene seed betraying them in ways no amount of discipline or training could prevent. We know now through the lore that Tzeentch had plans for the 1,000 Suns from the very beginning. The chaos god of change and manipulation was directly responsible for engineering the flesh change, threading corruption into their bloodline before they even knew his name. Magnus knew his legion was dying. He bargained to stop it. The entity he made his pact with, whose identity he didn't fully understand at the time, was Tzeentch himself, and the price was his right eye. The flesh change slowed, but it didn't stop. It went underground, suppressed rather than cured, waiting for the moment when one of his sons pushed his abilities past the limit of what the pact could hold. Under sufficient pressure, when a son overextended his gifts in combat, it could break through with no warning. The entire culture of the 1,000 Suns was constructed around concealing this. They killed their own when it happened. They kept the evidence from reaching anyone outside the Legion. As the source material puts it directly, the 1,000 Suns fought to control what was happening to them and to keep it a secret. Hastur didn't stay secret. Not that day, not on Shrike, not in front of the Space Wolves. Picture what Leman Russ actually witnessed. Not a gradual decline, not a Marine removed quietly to die in private. Something sudden and catastrophic, in full view of battle brothers from another Legion who had not been warned, had no context, and had no idea what they were seeing. A warrior of the Astartes, an enhanced transhuman soldier of the Emperor, one of the finest fighting beings the human race had ever produced, coming apart. His form losing coherence, his armor deforming around bones that were reshaping themselves without consent, moving beneath his skin like something autonomous and hostile was directing the process. The flesh change doesn't transform gradually. It doesn't give its victim time to retreat. It takes. Russ drew his sidearm and killed Hastur. Some accounts frame this as a mercy kill. It almost certainly was. A Marine dissolving into a chaos spawn has no future worth preserving, and Russ would have understood that immediately. But mercy doesn't change the political reality of what had just happened. The secret the Thousand Sons had spent decades guarding was now standing in front of a primarch who had both witnessed it and personally ended it. There was no ambiguity left to exploit, no version of this that Magnus could explain away. The confrontation that followed moved quickly towards something irreversible. Russ and Magnus closed toward each other in the immediate aftermath with the energy of two beings who were about to do something that couldn't be undone. Per the Warhammer 40k source material on this period, heavy bloodshed was only prevented by the intervention of Lorgar, Primarch of the Wordbearers. He physically stepped between them. He was reportedly warned that he might die for doing it, that the space between two Primarchs in that moment wasn't somewhere a third could stand without accepting genuine personal risk. That is how close it came. A third Primarch was willing to accept the possibility of his own death to prevent two of his brothers from destroying each other over what had just burned itself into the campaign record. That confrontation reveals two things simultaneously. First, the knowledge Russ walked away carrying wasn't rumor, not inference, not something he'd been told by a partisan source. He had watched it happen, killed the Marine himself, then stood face to face with Magnus while the evidence was still present between them. Whatever story Magnus might have constructed for a more distant audience, he couldn't construct it for Russ. Second, the relationship between these two Primarchs carried enough charge that lethal combat was a genuine, immediate possibility. This wasn't the dynamic of two men who regarded each other with comfortable contempt. Something real was at stake between them, something that felt, to both of them, worth fighting over. Russ walked away from Shrike having sworn what the sources describe as a blood oath against the Crimson King, promising there would be a reckoning between them. That oath complicates any clean reading of Russ as Magnus's quiet protector, and it should be named without flinching. A man who swears a blood oath against his brother isn't obviously a man who plans to shield him. But what matters for the argument here isn't what Russ said in the heat of that confrontation. What matters is what he actually did next. He reported what he'd seen. The incident contributed directly to prompting the Council of Nikaea, but he didn't wield it as a weapon to demand Magnus's destruction. What he did was go to Nikaea and argue for something that would only make sense if he was trying to solve a problem rather than eliminate a brother. The Council of Nikaea convened in 001.M31. The Emperor gathered representatives from across the legions to settle the question of psychic powers, whether librarians should remain permitted, whether psychers in the legions were an asset or a structural liability, and how much of the warp the Imperium was willing to let its warriors touch. Among the most vocal opponents of Legion psychers were Mortarion, Corvus Corax, and Leman Russ. Russ's documented arguments at Nikaea turned on three axes: the danger of uncontrolled warp contact, his personal view that any battle not decided by physical martial skill was dishonorable by definition, and his experiences fighting alongside the Thousand Sons, which included, specifically, what had happened on Shrike. Here is the critical thing about what Russ actually argued for at Nikaea, because this is where the thesis lives. He didn't demand Magnus be executed. He didn't stand before the council and use the flesh change as evidence that the Thousand Sons were beyond saving. He didn't use what he had witnessed as a weapon to destroy his brother. What Russ argued for was a blanket prohibition on Legion psychers, across all legions, including his own, under the direct, binding authority of the Emperor. The emperor's decree absolute at Nikaea stated it plainly. No legion would maintain a librarius department, and any who broke this would become the emperor's personal enemy, subject to destruction that would be remembered until the end of all things. From a purely tactical standpoint, this is a strange position for someone who simply hated Magnus and wanted him removed. A blanket ban across all legions does not target the Thousand Sons specifically. It doesn't expose their shame to the wider Imperium. It gives Russ no personal leverage over Magnus, no public vindication, no ability to point at Hastur's death on Shrike and say, "Look what your legion has become." What the edict does, if obeyed, is remove the primary trigger for the flesh change itself. The Thousand Sons mutation was driven by psychic overexertion, Marines pushing their abilities past the point of control, past what Magnus's pact with Tzeentch could suppress. An edict that stops all Legion Psyker activity, under pain of the Emperor's personal retribution, removes the fuel for the catastrophe Russ had watched consume Hastur in the Arc-Reach cluster. If the Thousand Sons stop using their powers, the most immediate trigger for the flesh change goes dormant. They don't dissolve in the field. Their secret holds. Their honor holds. Magnus doesn't have to watch his sons come apart in front of warriors from other legions who will use it against them. Looked at from that angle, the Edict of Nikaea is exactly the kind of structural protection a brother would engineer for someone he didn't know how to protect directly. A political solution that manages the danger without requiring the confrontation, without forcing Magnus to publicly admit that his legion was dying from inside. It lets Magnus keep his dignity while removing the thing that was going to destroy him. What Magnus felt when he heard Russ speak at the council supports this reading in a specific way. In A Thousand Sons, Magnus experienced genuine shock and sadness upon hearing Russ's advocacy. Not contempt, not fury, sadness. For a primarch who met most opposition with the serene confidence of a man who believed himself the most capable intellect in any room, that is an unusual and specific emotional note. It suggests that Russ's position landed with a different weight than a simple enemy's attack would have produced. It suggests Magnus understood, on some level, that Russ was saying something that carried genuine weight, even if Magnus refused to accept it, even if he stood up at the council and argued the opposite. The hypocrisy charge needs full acknowledgement here, because it's real and the audience knows it. Russ argued for banning Legion Psykers from all legions, then continued using rune priests in his own Space Wolves. His justification was that rune priests drew their power from Fenris, from the world itself, not from the warp the way the Thousand Sons drew on it. That what they practiced was different in kind from what Magnus's sons did. That argument doesn't survive scrutiny. The Horus Heresy source material explicitly states that rune priests are just as much psykers as the Thousand Sons, and that the edict as written covers them. Russ knew this. He acknowledged in his own framework that he was a hypocrite who bent the rules to suit his purpose as the Emperor's ultimate sanction. He wore that contradiction and kept going. A man can be a hypocrite and still be trying to protect someone. Both things are simultaneously true. The double standard on rune priests doesn't erase what the edict would have done for the Thousand Sons if Magnus had let it work. It just makes Russ messier and more human than the clean executioner reading allows for. And Magnus didn't let it work. That is where the tragedy begins in earnest. After Nikaea, Magnus publicly agreed to comply with the edict. Privately, he remained bitterly opposed and kept practicing sorcery in violation of it. The Thousand Sons continued their work in secret. Then Horus moved against the Emperor, and Magnus, who loved the Emperor with something approaching absolute religious devotion, decided the warning couldn't wait. He resolved to break the prescriptions of the edict and psychically contact the Emperor on Terra directly to warn him of Horus's impending betrayal. The message got through. It also tore open the Emperor's secret webway project, a massive, years-long construction effort to allow safe travel through the webway for human armies, collapsing the work and killing hundreds of people laboring inside it. The emperor's response was described in the sources as rage, not at Horus, not at the betrayal in the abstract, at Magnus, for doing the one thing he had been publicly, ceremonially, with the weight of the entire council behind it, told never to do. The orders that went to Leman Russ were, per Horus Heresy Book 7, Inferno, a writ of censure, ordering Magnus to be brought forth and bound by law to stand before the throne Imperial. This was an arrest order, capture, transport, and trial. The emperor sent Constantine Valdor alongside Russ to enforce it, the captain general of the Legio Custodes, commander of the emperor's personal bodyguard, the most loyal servant of the master of mankind alive. You don't send the captain of your personal guard on a murder mission. Valdor's presence establishes the emperor's actual intent. Magnus was supposed to face a trial, not an execution. Horus changed those operational parameters before Russ reached Prospero, not by forging documents or intercepting written dispatches, through personal authority and the weight of his relationship with Russ. Through a message delivered by the sons of Horus, he convinced Russ that returning Magnus to Terra was a waste of time and effort, that Magnus would never leave Prospero alive, regardless of what the writ said, and that the Space Wolves should proceed accordingly. The mechanism here matters enormously. Horus didn't contradict the Emperor's written orders. He changed the emotional and operational context around them, using his status as War Master and the genuine personal loyalty Russ held toward him to make the execution feel like the obvious, appropriate, inevitable response to what Magnus had done. Russ arrived at Prospero believing, at least partly, that this was what the Emperor actually wanted, even though the writ Valdor carried said otherwise. Before the first orbital bombardment, before a single space wolf set foot on Prospero's surface, Russ made one more attempt to stop what was coming. He sent a message to Magnus through Caspar Hauser, a remembrancer, a chronicle keeper embedded with the Space Wolves, who Russ believed had a connection to the Thousand Suns that could serve as a channel. The content of that message, as conveyed in Dan Abnett's Prospero Burns, wasn't a formal military ultimatum. It asked Magnus to evacuate civilians, deactivate all defenses, surrender himself and his legion. Those are the requests of a man trying to end something before it becomes irreversible, not the demands of someone looking for an excuse to burn. More than the content, it's the emotional register of what Russ put into that message that the text records. He opened himself in a way that Abnett's account describes as the most honest communication that had ever passed between these two brothers. He admitted that the duty was tearing at his heart. He was asking Magnus, not ordering, not threatening the way a conqueror threatens, asking him not to let it come to fire. Magnus never heard it. The message through Hauser didn't reach him. Magnus stood on Prospero believing Russ was coming, as he had always feared Russ would come, in uncomplicated fury, driven by the same contempt for psychic power that had put him on the wrong side at Nikaea. On the other side of that silence, Russ waited for a response to his plea and received nothing. He drew from that silence the only conclusion available. Magnus had considered and refused. Two brothers, one final conversation that never happened. One of them had never been more honest. The other never knew the conversation occurred. Prospero burned. The Space Wolves, the Legio Custodes, and the Sisters of Silence came down together onto a world that had been the Imperium's greatest library, its deepest reservoir of accumulated human knowledge stretching back to the Dark Age of technology. The city of Tizca fell. A second orbital bombardment followed, incinerating whatever the first pass had left combustible. Russ and Magnus met in single combat on the ground, two primarchs who had nearly killed each other over a dying Marine in the Arc Reach cluster, now fighting with everything the heresy had given them to fight with. Russ won. He had Magnus on the ground, beaten, broken, nearly dead, and he brought his blade around for the killing stroke. Magnus escaped. With the last of his strength, he used the sorcery that had always been the center of who he was, and Tzeentch received him. The Chaos God who had been threading his hooks through the Thousand Suns since before they knew his name finally collected on the debt, transforming Magnus into a demon prince and pulling him into the warp entirely. Russ stood over a battlefield he had won completely and had nothing to show for it that the Emperor had actually ordered. Magnus was gone, not dead, not captive, not delivered to Terra for trial, just gone, into the warp, into chaos, unreachable. The Thousand Suns were shattered. The greatest collection of human knowledge in the galaxy was rubble and cooling ash. And Russ told Rogel Dorn he was proud. He had to say that.
The alternative, admitting openly that Horus had manipulated him into destroying a brother he had spent years quietly trying to protect, a brother whose legion's secret he had carried from Shrike to Nikaea to the surface of Prospero, was too much to carry in public for a primarch who held himself responsible for outcomes. Per the novel Wolfsbane, the full internal picture is considerably more complicated. Russ is simultaneously proud of the outcome and regrets that with Magnus on their side, they could have beaten Horus. That isn't the emotional landscape of uncomplicated satisfaction. That is a man who understands, in the part of himself he doesn't speak about in front of other primarchs, that Horus removed the one brother the War Master feared most and used Russ to do it. Now the hardest charge, the one that actually lands without deflection. It's Leman's fault that the Emperor is dead. He could have killed Horus. He couldn't bring himself to do it. This is the version of events where Russ's personal failure cost the Imperium its living god, and it deserves to be taken seriously rather than argued around, because the facts of what happened on the Vengeful Spirit aren't in dispute. In the final years of the Horus Heresy, Russ conducted a boarding action on the Vengeful Spirit, Horus's flagship, the operational center of the entire traitor war machine. He fought his way through to Horus himself. The two met in combat, and an excerpt from the novel Wolfsbane describes what happened directly. Russ drove the Emperor's spear into the War Master's guts, and Horus roared in agony. The wound was severe enough that it left its mark, deep and persistent, something Horus carried from that engagement into everything that followed. Then Russ stopped. The killing blow was there. He hesitated. Horus, wounded but not finished, struck back. Russ withdrew without ending it. The Emperor went to the Vengeful Spirit later. Horus died there, destroyed by the Emperor at the cost of the Emperor's own mortal body, which was placed on the Golden Throne, where it has sat ever since, neither living nor dead, sustaining the Astronomicon and the Imperium's ability to function across 10,000 years of warfare. If Russ had killed Horus during that boarding action, the entire final sequence of the heresy runs differently. The charge stands. It's real. What it means is the question. An attack dog doesn't hesitate. That is the thing about this moment that cuts through the simple, mindless executioner reading with something close to surgical precision. A man who is capable only of violence, who acts purely on instinct and command, doesn't stand over a wounded enemy with a spear in his gut and find himself unable to complete the act. The hesitation requires something. It requires the weight of what this is. Not a battle, not a mission, not an enemy to eliminate, but a brother, even a fallen one, even one who had already killed millions, even one who had manipulated Russ into burning Prospero and destroying the very person Russ had spent years trying to protect. Russ had burned Prospero. He had conducted the destruction of an entire world civilization. He wasn't squeamish about violence in the abstract. What stopped him on the Vengeful Spirit was more specific than squeamishness. It was the accumulated weight of every choice he had made since Shrike, the knowledge he carried, the political solution he engineered at Nikaea, the plea through Caspar Hauser before the assault, the guilt he masked with pride in front of Rogel Dorn, all of it converging at the moment when the only thing left was to push the blade home. Every piece of evidence the lore offers about Leman Russ points to a man who was constitutionally a protector. He had been handed the executioner's role by the Emperor, and he wore it, and he did terrible things while wearing it, things that cost him more than he publicly acknowledged. But at the moment of pure, uncomplicated execution, when all it required was the final stroke, the protector in him won the argument. It was a catastrophic failure. The Emperor died partly because of it. But that failure isn't the fingerprint of a mindless brute. Mindless brutes don't fail by being unable to kill a brother.
They kill because that is what they do. Russ failed because he was something more complicated than his reputation allows, and the cost of that complexity was enormous and permanent and real. There is one more link in this chain that doesn't get sufficient attention, and it runs through Lorgar of the Wordbearers. Russ wounding Horus on the vengeful spirit didn't happen in isolation. The War Master's visible diminishment, a wound severe enough to leave its mark, inflicted during a boarding action that Horus survived only because Russ couldn't bring himself to finish it, was information that spread through the traitor camp. A War Master who can't withstand a boarding action from a single primarch, who walks away from his own flagship's interior visibly marked and diminished, is a War Master whose grip on authority is cracking in ways that the other traitor primarchs can observe and evaluate. Lorgar had been watching Horus lead the traitor cause with increasing alarm. The Primarch of the Wordbearers had come to believe that Horus was unfit to be War Master, that he would ultimately cause the loss of the traitor cause through his conduct and his refusal to submit to a broader vision of what the war against the Emperor was meant to accomplish. This belief, documented in the Warhammer 40k source material, led Lorgar to begin a conspiracy. He sought to use Fulgrim to remove Horus from power entirely, not from sentiment, not from loyalty, because he believed Horus was going to lose. Lorgar's conspiracy had ideological roots independent of any single event. The wound Russ opened in Horus, the visible, material, observable evidence that the War Master could be physically broken on his own flagship by a single boarding force, is the kind of evidence that makes a coup attempt feel rational rather than audacious. It shifts the political calculation inside the traitor alliance from "why would we undermine the War Master?" toward "how much longer can we afford not to?" Whether it was the direct trigger for Lorgar's move, the lore does not confirm. But Russ's failure to kill Horus wasn't strategically inert. The man he wounded didn't stay unwounded, and the alliance that watched it happen didn't stay intact. By 211 M31, the heresy was over. The Emperor was on the Golden Throne. The Imperium was broken and beginning the long work of reassembly. During the annual feast of the Emperor's Ascension, Leman Russ received a vision disturbing enough that he told his space wolves he was dying. He disappeared, taking only the warriors of his Varigir bodyguard with him. His destination wasn't announced. He is believed to have entered the Eye of Terror, Chaos's home territory, the wound in space where the warp bleeds directly into the material world, and he hasn't returned. That disappearance is the final fact the lore gives us, and it's the one that connects everything that came before it to the question the audience is actually asking. What happens to a man like this after the war ends the way this war ended? He reported what he'd seen on Shrike, and it didn't save Magnus. He engineered a political solution, and Magnus burned it the moment he had a reason to. He begged his brother to surrender, and the message never arrived. He was manipulated into destroying the person he was trying to protect, and Horus used him to remove the one Primarch the War Master feared most. He wounded Horus on the vengeful spirit and couldn't kill him, and the Emperor paid the price. He told Rogaldorn he was proud, and then he received a vision during a feast in the Emperor's name and walked into the Eye of Terror. What does the Eye of Terror do to Leman Russ over 10,000 years? The Space Wolves carry the Canis helix in their gene seed, a genetic marker tied to Fenris, to the predator lineage Russ himself embodies, one that already produces the Wolfen when it runs unchecked. Wolfen are space wolves who succumbed to this deepest layer of their genetics, not chaos-corrupted servants of the ruinous powers, but something older and more primal, enormously powerful, shaped by transformation that the space wolves have always carried as a possibility and never fully controlled. Sustained warp exposure over duration is exactly the kind of pressure that would push the Canis helix toward its furthest expression. 100 centuries in the Eye of Terror, hunting, surviving, fighting on Chaos's ground. That is Leman Russ subjecting his genetics to precisely the kind of accumulated transformative stress the setting's established mechanics make consequential. Two other Primarchs have returned to the 41st millennium. Robute Guilliman came back during the Gathering Storm and now leads the Indomitus Crusade.
anchoring the Ultramarines' modern narrative with a Primarch-scale model and a central role in the living setting. Lion L. Johnson awakened more recently from stasis beneath the rock and has re-entered the Dark Angel storyline, carrying 10,000 years of unresolved history into the current game. Both follow the same pattern: fiction and campaign seeds laid first, then model and rules. The infrastructure for Russ's return exists. His return hasn't been confirmed, but the thematic logic of what that return would mean, given everything the Heresy arc establishes about who Russ actually was, is the question the entire story leaves open. The wolf who tried to save everyone from becoming monsters, who witnessed the flesh change and carried that knowledge, who begged his brother to step back from the precipice and watched him fall anyway. What does that wolf become after 10,000 years in the place where transformation itself lives? The answer, whenever Games Workshop gives it, will tell us whether the lore's verdict on Leman Russ is tragedy or something stranger and harder to name. Here's what the full picture of Leman Russ looks like when you put the evidence together in sequence. He was on Shrike when Hastur flesh changed. He killed Hastur, confronted Magnus, nearly came to blows with him, stopped only because Lorgar physically stepped between them and accepted the risk of dying for it, and walked away carrying knowledge that the Thousand Sons were being consumed by their own gifts. He went to Nikaea in 001.M31 and argued for a prohibition that would have removed the flesh change's primary trigger, not to destroy Magnus publicly, to protect him from the thing that was going to kill his legion whether Magnus admitted it or not. Magnus, bitterly and brilliantly opposed to that protection, defied the edict the moment he felt he had sufficient reason, burned his own safeguard to send a warning, and the Emperor's rage sent Leman Russ to answer for it. The Emperor's original order was an arrest. Constantine Valdor was sent specifically to ensure Magnus arrived on Terra alive. Horus altered those operational parameters through personal authority and persuasion before Russ ever reached Prospero. Russ, operating under manipulated orders, still tried one last time, opening himself through Caspar Hauser in the most honest communication these two brothers ever had, admitting that the duty was tearing at his heart, asking Magnus not to let it come to fire. The message never arrived. Prospero burned. Magnus escaped into Tzeentch's arms rather than face judgment. And Russ told Rogel Dorn he was proud, because the alternative was acknowledging, in public, that Horus had used him to remove the brother he had spent years quietly trying to protect. He boarded the vengeful spirit. He drove the Emperor's spear into Horus's body. He couldn't finish it, because Russ wasn't, at the core of it, an executioner. He was a protector who had been given the executioner's role and wore it at enormous cost. And at the final moment of pure execution, the protector won the argument with everything else he had ever been trained and ordered to become. In 211 M31, he walked into the Eye of Terror. He is still there. The question of whether Leman Russ was the Emperor's mindless attack dog answers itself once you put the evidence in order. Mindless attack dogs don't engineer political solutions at Imperial councils. They don't plead with enemies through intermediaries before assaults. They don't hesitate with the killing blow inside an enemy war master's body and then carry the weight of that hesitation for the rest of the war. Every charge against Russ, the Nikaea advocacy, the burning of Prospero, the failure on the vengeful spirit, holds a different shape when you know what happened on Shrike, what Russ chose to do with that knowledge, and what he tried to say to Magnus in the silence before the fire came. He tried to save the Thousand Sons. The lore, read closely enough, tells you exactly that. Almost nobody was paying attention. Subscribe if this is the kind of deep lore breakdown you want more of.